Hello everyone. What I'd like to cover in this video is the concept of the everyday heroic. We talked about, and I'll reflect on that again a bit later in the video, about the difficulty that I see with the superhero moving heroism or the concept of heroism out of the reach of the average person. And so I've subtitled this "Well Within Reach," is to show that the heroic is within reach and is a possibility for the everyday person. Just a quick review here: the heroic journey, as depicted by Vogler, based on Campbell, the departure, fulfillment, and return phases, with the 12 steps of the ordinary world, the call to adventure, the refusal of the call, meeting with the mentor, crossing the first threshold, the fulfillment phase of tests, allies, and enemies, approach to the Inmost Cave, the ordeal, and the reward or seizing of the sword, in Campbell's words. And then the return phase. And remember, I mentioned that this is kind of easy to remember because they all have an R. The road back, resurrection or purification, and return with the elixir. So I want to reminders, start to do some reminders here about what is important about these before we start going into it specifically. The first step in the heroic journey is the ordinary world, not the call to adventure. This helps to set up the contrast with the special world. And I talked about in class about how if you're writing a mystery novel, you don't have to explain certain basic concepts. But if you're writing fantasy or science fiction, you have to well establish that ordinary world of your characters so that your reader or your audience knows when the special world appears. The steps, as we saw in the previous slide, don't necessarily have to come in the precise order that they're listed. Recall that Bilbo's mentor, Gandalf, actually brings the call to adventure. And so the meeting with the mentor doesn't have to be step 4. It actually occurs between steps 1 and 2, where the ordinary world of Bilbo is disrupted by the arrival of Gandalf. Also, remember that Alice doesn't meet any of her mentors until she's already in Wonderland. Certain steps can be in an instant or be drawn out over time. We talked about particularly the crossing of the threshold. Sam takes a single step into his special world in Farmer Maggot's field, where Frodo's step into his special world lasts from leaving the Shire right up to the point of leaving Rivendell to go to Mordor. The cave need not be an actual cave. It doesn't even need to be a physical location. As I talked about for Bilbo in Lothlorien, the cave is actually his own doubt. And the ordeal need not be a physical weapons battle. It can be an internal struggle. Again, the struggle that that Frodo experiences in Lothlorien when he is shown the ultimate consequences to the Shire if he fails. The resurrection or purification tends not to be literal in modern stories, and we'll talk more about this here in a moment. In the classical world, it certainly was. The hero had been to the land of death or into a foreign land, and he had to be purified, ritually purified with a black bath or shower or something in order to be able to re-enter polite society. We don't see that so much in the modern motif. The elixir does not need to actually be a potion. It doesn't actually have a physical form at all. And it need not actually change the ordinary world. It needs only to have the potential to do so. Bringing about sweeping change in the ordinary world is not the measure of the success of the heroic character. Their journey and the elixir they return with needs to have the capacity to create change if those around them are able to assimilate it and develop it into a new way of life, a new way of seeing things. The heroic character need not actually physically die in order to have acted heroically. They need only to be willing to die or to endure some form of personal sacrifice. So I want to share a story with you. It's a true story, and I know everybody always says this is a true story, but it really is. It happened in New York a few years ago. Bus driver was driving his route with a bus full of people on their way to wherever they were going, and he's driving over an overpass and glances out the right side of the bus and sees a woman on the other side of the railing getting ready to jump off the railing and commit suicide. And he brings the bus to a stop, and we see him reach up and grab the radio mic and call in something. We don't hear what it is he says or what is said back to him. He opens the bus doors and calls out to her, "Miss, do you need help?" No response. He calls out to her again, still no response, no indication that she's even heard him. And then a third time, and it's still no response. At that point, he gets up, and we can tell by the way he acts that he's indicating to the passengers to stay seated. And he walks off the bus, steps off the bus onto the bridgeway there, and slowly crosses over to where she is, speaks to her for a few minutes quietly. Eventually, she kind of turns and reaches out her hand, and he takes her hand and helps her back over the railing, and then brings her back to the curbside by the bus, and they sit there together and continue to converse until an ambulance pulls up, and then he gives care of her over to the EMTs, and she is taken away in the ambulance. He gets back onto the bus to a standing ovation from the bus patrons, takes his seat, closes the doors, and continues on with his route for the day. Now, of course, this being the modern world, people share this event through social media. He comes to the attention of the talk show hosts, and everybody wants him to come be on their talk show, and he spent a few weeks doing the talk show circuit and sharing his story. And then things, as often happen in the United States, just sort of faded out of consciousness. So what I would like to do is ask the question, explore the question, can we find most or all of the Vogler-Campbell 12 steps in this story that we've just shared? So what I'm going to do for the rest of this presentation is go through the steps in order as listed on the second slide, and let's see if we can find some way that the story that we've just shared reflects that step. So let's look at the ordinary world of the bus driver here. What constitutes elements of the ordinary world for him? Well, I would say his home, right? The place where he gets up in the morning and puts on his uniform and shaves and has breakfast and so forth. The city that he lives in New York in this particular instance. It's a place that he's been for years. He knows it. He is familiar with it. It's not a strange place to him. It's every day. The bus terminal where he goes to get on his bus and begin his route. Part of his everyday activity. The bus itself. The way that it functions. Maybe it sticks a little turning to the right, or you got to pump the brakes a couple of times before pressing. This is all part of his ordinary world, the stuff that he does every day, all the time. The route itself, the scenery and the landmarks that he sees every day as he's driving his route. And the passengers on the bus. These may not shift, they may shift a little bit, where you have some people you've never seen before, they come and go, but there are probably some people that ride that bus every day to the same places, to and from. I'm always reminded of one of the early scenes in Speed with Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves, where she's riding the bus and having conversations with those around her and the bus driver, and it's very clear that they all know each other really well, that they're all on the same bus every day. So this is, as Campbell says, the realm which he controls and knows about. These things that are not strange to him or new to him. They're everyday, almost blasé or passé. I think his call to adventure is an instantaneous call. I think it happens in the instant of him seeing the woman on the other side of the railing. Well, how can we say this is his call to adventure? I think it's because it's something that's out of the ordinary. He drives over that bus every day on his route, but he doesn't see a woman preparing to commit suicide on that bridge every day. So this is something that is immediately out of the ordinary, that signals to him that something different is going on. It is a departure from the routine of his daily chore of driving the bus, and it presents him with an opportunity to do something beyond his normal range of actions. So he's called to adventure. He's given an opportunity to do something out of the ordinary. And that leads us then to a question of the refusal of the call. Let's remember that the refusal is most often associated with the forced or the serendipitous heroic. And this allows us to examine the question, which kind of heroic is he have the opportunity to be? I would immediately say not intentional. I think it's very safe to say that he did not start his day getting on the bus with the mindset that I'm going to do something different today. I'm going to shake it up today. I'm going to stir it up today. Forced? He's not. It's not like somebody on the bus is saying, hey, there's a woman over there on the wrong side of the bridge. You have to do something about it. So I think if we decide he's heroic, it's got to be serendipitous. It's got to be accidental. That this is something that just appears in his life and he has to make a decision about how to act. Think about it this way. If he had been looking in his left side mirror, watching for traffic coming up on his left side and never noticed her over there, he would never have had an opportunity to act. He would have missed the call. So I think this definitely defines him as a serendipitous heroic, if we decide that he's heroic in the long run. We don't see an overt refusal of the call, because he does eventually get off the bus. We can surmise, however, that there must have been some doubt in his mind as to the best course of action to take. This makes sense if you think about yourself in this sort of a circumstance. He is a bus driver. He is a public servant. He has responsibility for the people on that bus. He may suffer a real consequence at work if he gets off that bus and leaves his bus patrons unattended. He could lose his job. If he's got a family to support, what's going to happen to them if his paycheck stops coming in? What if he says the wrong thing? What if he can't help her? What if she jumps anyway? These are all things that are almost certain to have gone through his mind that he has to overcome. There are tests before entering the special world that he has to overcome and surmount before he can act. The driver meets some of his allies and enemies at this stage before even entering the special world. Any ally is any person or place or thing or situation which aids the heroic character in making decisions and taking actions that move them toward their ultimate goal. And there are two basic types of allies. There's active and passive. An active ally assists the heroic character in some instrumental way toward the goal, and these are often called mentors. More on that in a moment. An example is Obi-Wan giving Luke his father's lightsaber. He instrumentally affects Luke's decision-making process. The discovery of the Jawas that have been murdered by the agents of the Empire. Obi-Wan contextualizes that for Luke in a way that helps Luke make his decisions. A passive ally doesn't materially assist the heroic character, but also doesn't functionally inhibit their actions. So that would be a person, place, thing, or situation which makes the hero or helps the hero to understand that they should act in a certain way, but that ally is not actively saying you need to do this. More on this in a minute. An antagonist is any person, place, thing, or situation which impedes the heroic character from making decisions and taking actions which would move them toward their ultimate goal. And again, we have two types, active and passive. The active antagonist instrumentally interferes with the heroic character's ability to take action toward the goal. And we often use the word enemies for active antagonists. Those that lock a door that the hero needs to go through, or throw up obstacles in their path, or lure them into a box canyon or whatever, things that are going to impede the hero's progress. A passive antagonist indifferently interferes with the heroic character's ability to take action toward the goal. And this is a marvelous example of a situation or a place that becomes a passive antagonist. You and your adventuring troop are going off across the countryside, and you encounter a big chasm that doesn't have a bridge across it. That chasm is an antagonist. It is impeding your progress. But it's not an enemy because it's not doing so consciously. The chasm isn't lying there in the ground thinking, I'm going to stop the hero. No, it's just there. It's an obstacle that you have to overcome, and it is impeding your progress, but it is not acting against you. Mentors need not be allies. Most often, or quite often, the mentor is an ally, but anything, as we said before, that helps to continue the hero's progress, or to help the hero develop the mindset that he or she needs to do the job, can act as a mentor. And so, in fact, the villain can be a mentor to the heroic by showing it the kinds of actions the heroic doesn't want to engage in. The heroic can look at the villain and say, well, I know I don't want to be that. And that helps the heroic to understand the task that lies before it and the proper ways for it to behave. Also, antagonists don't need to be enemies, and we just kind of talked about that with the chasm. It is an antagonist, but it's not an active enemy. The villain is a special type of antagonist or enemy whose primary motivation is to prevent the success of the heroic character. So the villain is very definitely an active antagonist. It is an enemy. It's a special kind of enemy. We often refer to it as the big bad. This may be because the villain has a goal of their own. They've got something they're trying to accomplish, which they may believe is proper behavior, the proper thing to do. Or they may simply not want to see the heroic character succeed for whatever reason. In any case, they are actively throwing up obstacles and taking actions that interfere with the hero's progress. The driver probably met many of his mentors long before that day. Anyone who had ever taught him about what proper behavior is was a mentor. Priests, preachers, teachers, parents, grandparents, heroes of his own that he found in the television shows that he watched, or the movies that he watched, or the books or the graphic novels that he read. These all act as mentors and allies, and we carry those with us. These ideas that we have, Campbell talked about how he had a certain actor, a certain character in the black and white movies that he watched that made him want to be like that. And so his future behavior was in part predicated on him wanting to behave like that heroic character. So in this sense, it is possible for a heroic character to be their own mentor, in that they have a certain level of expectation for their own behavior that they feel they need to live up to. And to not do what they know is right, or what they believe is right, would be to counter that internal mentor that they carry with them. And I strongly suspect that the driver had a lot of these kind of internal mentors encouraging him. He has some potential active antagonists in the passengers. He has stopped the bus. They're not getting to where they're going. They may have to be at work at a certain time, and any delay is going to make them late. So they are potential active antagonists. They could get up and make a fuss and say, no, we let somebody else handle it. Just call it in. We need to get to work. The drivers of other vehicles on the road, he stopped his bus in the lane there, and people behind him can't easily get around him. They could, get out of their cars and prevent him from getting off the bus. Say, move this thing, get it moving. So these are potential active antagonists that he has to be prepared to deal with. Also, anyone on the radio, when he called in on the radio, who may have discouraged his actions, saying, no, you are responsible for the people on the bus. Don't get off that bus. He's got to overcome that negative signal from them in order to act to address the situation. Passive antagonists, like gravity. If she steps off, she's going down. It's not like Wile E. Coyote, who's got 2 seconds after he stops off the bus to decide, off the cliff to decide whether that was a good thing to do or not. She'll go down as soon as she steps off. The railing is a passive antagonist in the sense that it's between her and safety. Neither of those are active. The gravity is not trying to kill her. It's not down there at the bottom under the bridge waiting with evil chuckles for her to step off. The railing isn't forcing her, it's not pushing her, but it is an antagonist of his in that it's between her and her safety. He's got some potential active allies. Anyone on the radio who may have encouraged his action, saying, yes, go do something about that. Any MTs who might be on their way. These are active allies who will eventually be there to help him ensure her safety. He has some passive allies in the passengers on the bus. Now, I know we just talked about them as potential passive antagonists, but the fact that they're not getting up out of their seats and trying to prevent him from getting off the bus and making a fuss about him delaying them means that they are passively allying themselves to him. They're not impeding him from doing what he believes needs to be done. And the same is true of the drivers of the other vehicle. By not honking at him, by not shaking their fists in anger at him, imagine that, this is New York, they are passive allies. They're not impeding him from doing what needs to be done. The bridge itself is a passive ally in that it's holding her up. It is taking the force of gravity beneath her and preventing her from falling farther down. Again, it's not doing so consciously. It's not saying, oh, I've got to keep her from falling. The railing is a passive ally here as well. Even though it is a passive antagonist, it's also a passive ally because she's holding on to it and it's keeping her from falling. So who is the villain in this story? Well, I think it's the woman herself, because she is placing herself in danger. She's threatening her own life. She's also, however, the damsel. It has become his task now to rescue her from the danger in which she's put herself. So this is a marvelous example of a single character in the story carrying multiple archetypes at the same time. She's the villain, she's causing the problem, but she's also putting herself in danger, so she becomes the thing that needs rescuing, the problem that needs solving. And she is also, at least in part, an ally. How can we say that she is in part an ally to him? Well, quite simply, she hasn't jumped yet. There is some part of her mental state that is still undecided. And if he can reach that part and bring it to the fore, then he can save her life. So that is a potential ally that he has. I think this is a drawn-out threshold crossing. Yes, we can say that he crosses the threshold into the special world when he steps off the bus. But I believe that stepping off the bus is the end result of a sequence of events that began with the call to adventure. Now, at the moment of seeing her, he has to start making decisions and dealing with tests in not knowing what to do or taking the risk of acting, and many of the doubts that the driver likely had in the refusal phase are still with him as he leaves the safety of the bus. So he builds up to that moment of stepping off, in the same way that Frodo builds up to that moment of leaving the gate at Rivendell to go to Mordor. Everything up to that point has led up to him making that decision. What makes up the special world in this story? I think it's the bridge and the far side of the railing. Even though the bridge and the railing are a normal, ubiquitous part of the city, they've taken on a new special character because of the peculiarities of this particular circumstance. They are contributing to the danger that she is in, not something that is part of their normal status. Neither the bridge nor the railing are being used in the ways in which they were originally intended to be used. They are to keep cars from falling down to the ground below, and that is what their normal use is for, and they're now being used by a consciousness in a negative way. And neither the driver nor the woman have ever interacted with either the bridge or the railing in this particular way before. It's a new interaction with these things that makes them special in a way that they were not or have not been. As he enters the special world, he is again carrying with himself the doubts that he has, but his own expectations for his behavior. He begins to have to worry about, how should I approach this? Rapidly running up to her and saying, "Hey, idiot, what the hell do you think you're up to?" is probably not the best way to start trying to solve this problem. So he's got to be thinking about, what are the rules of the special world? What can I do and what can't I do that are going to benefit or detriment this situation? And as he approaches this problem and works through this problem, he's approaching the Inmost Cave. So what can we say constitutes the Inmost Cave in this story? Recall that the Inmost Cave is the most dangerous place in the special world. It's the place where the hero has the most chance of failing, of not achieving the goal. Recall also that the object of the quest is often found here, and this is where the ordeal takes place. So I believe the Inmost Cave in this story is actually her mental state, as it relates to the actual inciting event that caused her to climb over to the other side of the railing. He has to get into her head, in the modern vernacular. Through conversation with her, he's got to figure out what has happened here, what has put her there, and figure out how he can address that, how he can recontextualize that for her so that it's not such a dire thing in her mind that she's willing to come back over the railing. And so the Inmost Cave here isn't a physical place. It's her mentality that he's got to get into, that he's got to address and deal with. So how is her mental state the most dangerous place in the special world? Well, to her, it's the thing that pushed her to threaten her own life. And we don't know what that is, and neither does he as he's approaching. It could be something really heinous. It could be that he finds out through conversation with her that she's had a long history of mental illness and cracked that morning and killed her whole family. He doesn't know what it is he's going to have to deal with. And so to him, it is the most dangerous place because it's potentially a challenge which he might not be able to overcome, or which he might end up falling prey to himself. He might find himself in the mindset after hearing her story that, yeah, you should jump, but there's no fixing this. He can't go there. He can't allow that to happen to himself. He has to maintain, as we talked about in class, that higher moral standard and convince her to come back over the railing. What is his ordeal in this Inmost Cave? He must be able to listen to her story without being overwhelmed by it. No matter what he hears from her, he's got to distance himself from that and find ways to minimize that in her mind in this moment so that it ceases to be a trigger for her desire to end her own life. He must be able to interact with her in a calming, soothing manner that won't make her actually jump. Again, he doesn't want to just run up and say, "Hey, idiot, what the hell do you think you're up to?" He's got to be able to not exacerbate the situation through what it is that he is trying to accomplish. And so he's got to be able to reach that part of her that has so far prevented her from jumping and convince it to take over control of her actions. That part of her that obviously does still want to live because it's still clinging on to the railing. Now, we see that, or we heard in the story, that eventually, after a few minutes of conversation, she does turn and reach out to him and offer her hand, and he takes her hand and helps her back over the railing. So we need to talk about what is the driver's reward in this situation. And I think it's important to note that his reward is not saving her life. That is simply the outcome of his journey. I believe that his reward is the moment when she reaches out to him so he can help her back over the railing. So why would I say that this is his reward? Well, because it is the immediate result of his efforts to save her life. In that moment, she knows that his efforts have been successful and she no longer plans to jump. So his reward is that instant, in that moment of when things are still going on, when it is made clear that he has accomplished what he set out to do. He has stopped her in this moment from taking her own life. The step that follows is the road back. The object has been achieved. She is on this side of the railing. Her life is now saved, at least in this moment. So what is the road back? Let's recall that the heroic character is often pursued by agents of the enemy while returning from the ordeal and moving back toward the ordinary world. So what might we say are the agents of the enemy in this story that might pursue the heroic character? Well, I think her reasons for being there are certainly agents of the enemy. Her situation hasn't been resolved. Whatever put her there hasn't been dealt with and taken out of her life. She's merely been distanced from the trigger enough for the moment not to be reacting to it as severely as before. I think also agents of the enemy are his own doubts and uncertainties. He could still say something that would upset her enough for her to break loose and go running back over and just sail right over that railing. So he still has to deal with maintaining the proper attitude, the proper tone of voice, the proper conversational tone, the proper language to use. The enemy here, I think, that makes one final all-out effort to win might also be his own uncertainty about whether or not he deserves attention for his actions. That potential for, people are going to know about this. How am I going to look? He's got to put that aside. He's got to not let those doubts enter his mind here. The heroic character in modern stories often doesn't need to be cleansed in the traditional sense from the effects of their journey. In this instance, I think the purification the driver receives is when he gets back on the bus and the patrons give him a standing ovation. I think they are telling him, we approve of what you've done. We acknowledge that it was worth doing. We choose not to be upset at the delay this has caused us personally. We are purifying you. We are giving you permission to remove from your mind any doubts that you may have had about whether this was the proper thing to do. That is a kind of purification, a kind of resurrection. He's being allowed back onto the bus to begin participating in the ordinary world again. Remember also that the heroic character has often becomes more attractive as a result of surviving the ordeal. And as I said, I think this is attractive not so much in the sense of becoming physically more beautiful, but the ovation that the driver receives is also an acknowledgement by the passengers that they recognize him as trustworthy and reliable. They're more certain than ever. Should they ever need help themselves, they can rely on him to be there. Probably people thinking, I'll never ride another bus route in my life. I want to be on the bus with this guy. So his personal charisma has been increased in their eyes, though his physical form has not been altered. Return with the elixir. And I think the elixir here is not the woman, nor the woman's life. I think the elixir is the fact that he saved her life. I want to take a moment to step away for a second here and talk about the word just. And I don't mean just in a legal sense, that is just behavior. I mean just in a sort of dismissive sense, in the way that we use it in the vernacular when we say, well, it's just a scratch, meaning only. It kind of dismisses it. It's nothing really to be concerned with. And so I don't want to say that he is just a bus driver. That's dismissive. That is demeaning. But he's not a firefighter or a police officer or an EMT or a mental health worker. Yet he was able to reach out a hand to someone in need, literally, and help them out of a life-threatening situation when it arose. And the time he spent on the talk show circuit and the fact that we studied this experience in class proves that the elixir that he brought back was a valuable, powerful, enduring one. And so the fact that he is in very real senses an everyday person who has behaved in an extraordinary way is part of the elixir that he brings back. We hear this story and we think, if he can do it, maybe I could do it. And I'm sure, I know I can speak for myself, I imagine many of you also have had the experience of watching a TV show or a movie and someone is confronted with an unusual circumstance, an opportunity to behave heroically, and we ask ourselves, would I be able to do that in that situation? He doesn't have to ask himself that anymore. He knows. He did it. And by doing it where other people could see him do it, he encourages other people to believe that they also have the capacity to act heroically. That is the true purpose of the heroic archetype, to remind you that you have the capacity for heroism, that you have the capacity to rise above what you think are your own limitations, to rise above your fears, to rise above your personal challenges that you place on yourself and do something extraordinary. Recall that the elixir doesn't need to actually change the ordinary world. It needs only to have the potential to do so. This is very important. If not a single person's life were ever changed by his actions, including the woman's life, his action was still heroic, even if no one had ever even heard of what he did. If it had happened in the middle of the night when he was driving home and he didn't have a bus full of people, it was just him and his car, this would still be a heroic act. Well, why? Because he put his physical, emotional, psychological, and financial life on the line to help this woman without regard to the possible consequences to himself. The willingness to sacrifice. Also because in true heroic fashion he acted immediately to address the situation. He didn't delay with debate or uncertainty about whether or not to act as necessary. Now, reflecting back, we talked about the threshold crossing and the potential refusal of the call, and we said, yeah, he probably had a moment of doubt there. Weren't going through his mind, what happens if I do it wrong? What happens if she dies anyway? What will be the consequences to me? What if I lose my job? But all that went through his mind in a nanosecond. He didn't take 10 minutes to think about the situation. That's the point that I'm making here. He acted immediately in terms of the larger picture to address the situation. That is heroism. That's the definition of heroism. But looking deeper, has he ensured the woman's survival permanently? No, he has not. She may yet take her own life at some other time in the future. She could be on a 72-hour hold in a hospital, psych hold, and then go home and take a whole bottle of pills. She could still do that. She may die of a disease or perish in an accident, or any other kinds of things could happen to her. That is not his responsibility. Once he has gotten her on the other side of the railing and given over care of her to the EMTs, his responsibility for her ends. Saving her life on that day was relevant only to that day, in that particular set of circumstances and in that particular place. Nothing before or after the events of that day has any bearing whatsoever on those events. Very important. No actions, for good or ill, on the bus driver in the bus driver's past have any bearing on the heroism of saving the woman's life that day. We don't know anything about him as a person. It doesn't matter. The fact that he saved her life was a heroic act, regardless of what behaviors he may have engaged in before. Nothing the bus driver may do for good or ill in the future will have any bearing on the heroism of saving the woman's life that day. I mentioned that he goes on the talk show circuit for a while. I imagine that is pretty stressful. There's going to come a morning 6 weeks later when yet somebody else wants to have him come on their talk show, when he's tired of it and just wants to get back to his normal life, and he snaps at his wife at breakfast. That is a normal human reaction. It does not erase the heroism of saving that woman's life. This is also important. Nothing the woman herself may have done in her past, nor anything she may yet do in her future, has any bearing on the heroism of saving her life that day. It doesn't matter who she is. If she did murder her whole family that morning, it is still an act of heroism that he is saving her life in that moment, because who she is and what she has done does not enter his mind. He doesn't stop to consider that. He sees a life that needs saving and he acts to save it. A marvelous example of this from history, which people can sometimes find a little difficult to stomach, is the story that when he was a young man of about 8, Adolf Hitler fell through the ice on a frozen river, and a local priest jumped into the river and pulled him out and saved his life. That was a heroic act on the part of the priest. And the fact that Hitler becomes dictator of Germany and responsible for 12 million deaths 40, 50 years down the line has no bearing on the heroism of saving that little boy from that river on that day. This also brings up the point that we should describe the action as heroic and not describe the person as being a hero. The reason I say this is because I believe describing the person as a hero puts a level of expectation on their future behavior they can't hope to always live up to. I touched on this already before. If the bus driver snaps at his wife at breakfast, that does not erase the heroism of what he did. He cannot be expected to act heroically in every moment of his life from that point forward. It's just not a reasonable expectation. Also, I think this is valid because, as we talked about before, archetypes are recognized by their actions, not by the character performing them. And so to call someone a hero means that they must forever after behave heroically. That's putting focus on the character that is taking the heroic actions, not the actions themselves. And this is particularly damaging should the person ever need to reach out for help and feel unable to do so, because they might come to believe that a hero should always be able to help themselves. I see this all the time in members of the police forces or firefighters, EMTs, veterans who've been in combat, declining the heroic label because they take this attitude of, well, I didn't win the war all by myself. Well, you weren't supposed to. Nobody expected you to. But you went. You ran into that burning house. You went up against that mass murderer with an AK-47. You took the risk. You put yourself at risk. That was a heroic act. A heroic act should always be recognized as a heroic act without qualification or limitation, and that includes qualification or limitation you put on yourself. No heroic act should ever label or limit a person's ability to act as necessary in the future in unpredictable circumstances. And if you've got this idea in your head of what heroic is, and that prevents you from being able to act in future circumstances, then it's become a negative thing. You still behaved heroically in that moment, but the attitude that you and others are taking about that heroic act is getting in the way of you being able to live a normal human life. And remember, that's what Campbell says is the core of the heroic, to teach us how to live a human lifetime under any circumstances. Recall, this is also related to the problem of the superhero. Heroism is not about saving the world by shifting it around and changing the rules and so forth. The superhero moves that criteria for heroism beyond the reach of the average person. It sets the bar too high. If I can't behave heroically in every moment, that prevents you from, one, being able to act heroically, and two, being able to recognize the heroism of the act that you perform. Was the bus driver's act a heroic act? I believe yes, it was. We found all 12 steps of the Vogler-Campbell description of the heroic journey in this story to a greater or lesser degree. Any act of self-sacrifice, not just giving one's life, is heroic and deserves to be recognized as such. So the bus driver did put his life on the line. I mean, it may have happened that when he took her hand, she may have jumped and pulled him over. He didn't know what was going to happen in that moment, but he took that risk. He risked his financial stability. What if I get fired? He risked his psychological safety. What if she jumps anyway? I'm going to have to carry that for the rest of my life, that I failed, that I didn't save her. He took those risks and acted in the moment to do what was right and proper. So I have a discussion scenario for you. You've been planning on going to a concert for many months to see a band you've always wanted to see and who will no longer be touring after this concert, so it's now or never if you're ever going to see them live. Your grandparent has an accident and needs to be taken to the hospital. You give away your concert tickets, take them to the emergency room, and stay with them until they are released. Was your act heroic?